Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And here's one of the reviews you guys have been asking for. The new album from Chris Brown, X. One of the hardest things for any critic to do is to separate one's feelings regarding the artist from the art itself. It's something that can be anathema to some people who aren't critics, because to them, the artist's presence is so intertwined with what the art is that they can't see the separation, and thus they perceive any attack on the art as an attack on the artist. An attack that's often undeserved. It might be considered completely unfair, and sure, I can get those feelings, but that's not quite the case here, because Chris Brown's music is easily the least interesting and, well, least hateable part of his persona, both artistic and personal. It's not worth my time to go through the banner list of all the terrible things that Chris Brown has said and done over the past 5 years. That's well documented elsewhere, as well as the fact that he's clearly learned nothing from it thanks to a total lack of accountability on his part. But that can distract many critics from judging the art fairly instead of judging the artist, mostly because it's so easy to judge the artist. And it gets even harder when it becomes plainly apparent that the artist's life and experiences have influenced his songwriting. So, as a critic, where do you draw the line here? Well, here's always been my policy. It becomes important to understand why certain songwriting decisions were made, so ultimately you have to know the history, but ultimately the art has to stand on its own regardless of the artist's life and personal experiences. And on that note, Chris Brown has made some of the worst music of the past 5 years. And when I say worse, I mean that Graffiti and Fortune were some of the worst albums of their respective years, 2009 and 2012, and deserve nothing more than scorn and absolute derision because they are absolute torture to listen through. Even Forgiving All My Enemies, the acronym FAME, had its fair amount of turds like Deuces and Look at Me Now and She Ain't You. Interspersed between the upbeat dance tracks were really the only saving grace of that album. And thus, I've had a certain amount of morbid curiosity in looking up this album, X, the long-delayed album from Chris Brown that promised to go more towards R&B than modern dance pop, which made sense given the changing trends on the charts, but every single one of this guy's singles was giving me a really bad feeling about this album. But I figured I'd try to be fair, and I'd give Chris Brown the chance he heartily does not deserve, and I listened through this album. How is it? Well, you know what? It's better than Fortune and Graffiti, but that's not exactly an endorsement because, well, it's a Chris Brown album, displaying all the problems that haven't gone away in Chris Brown album after Chris Brown album, which ultimately consign it, at least in my books, to mediocrity, if that. That being said, it's an album that in its deep cuts show Chris Brown starting to become a little bit of a better singer-songwriter, albeit not consistently enough to make this album worth salvaging, at least in my opinion. So, okay, let's start with the biggest problem on this album. Chris Brown himself. Now, okay, besides being cute here, I've said in the past that when placed against his contemporaries in modern R&B and hip-hop, Chris Brown rarely brings a unique stage presence and personality to the table. And the worst possible thing he can do is invite comparisons to his competition in this genre. Yet, nobody told Chris Brown that because he chose to overload this album with his contemporaries in R&B and modern hip-hop who are significantly more interesting than he is, especially given the heavy abuse of auto-tune and pitch correction on Chris Brown's voice. We'll come back to that, but the first and most egregious example of this is New Flame, where Chris Brown is joined by Rick Ross dropping a marginally interesting verse, blending sports and luxury rap imagery that I didn't mind. But Chris Brown is also paired with Usher, and Usher blows Chris Brown off the stage. It's like the difference between Christina Aguilera and Mariah Carey. Chris Brown, like Christina Aguilera, makes it look like work, while Usher, it's all natural talent, and he makes it look easy and fun. And what's all the more disappointing is that Usher and Chris Brown, they have little to no interesting harmonies or interplay as singers, which implies that they were set up as competition, the two of them with their own unique choruses, and man, it does not look good for Chris Brown. And you know what the insane thing is? That this keeps happening. Drown On It pairs Chris Brown with R. Kelly on it and singing a song about cunnilingus, and even though we're dealing with a song about eating pussy, that's more explicit than either man reasonably should be singing given their past, and yet R. Kelly is a good enough performer that he can make his lyrics at least somewhat work while Chris Brown just comes across like a moron. Hell, when he gets Trey Songz, the R. Kelly wannabe, on Songs on 12 Play, where Trey Songz' verse is more explicit than Chris Brown still manages to look worse. Now, the problem here is twofold. Firstly, the autotune strips away a lot of Chris Brown's unique vocal personality, and whenever the autotune is actually eased back, he sounds a fair bit better. And the second problem is that Chris Brown has chosen to embrace the aggressive side of his vocal delivery more often than he really should, which not only makes him appear like a real asshole, but only serves as more uncomfortable reminders of his past, especially when he starts yelling. It's telling that it takes a collaboration with Akon on Came to Do for Chris Brown to come out ahead and start looking actually halfway decently. That's only because Akon took Chris Brown's approach and amped it up to 11, both with the autotune and the aggression to really unflattering points. And the exasperating thing is that Chris Brown is still trying to frame himself as this alpha male ladies man who is never in the wrong, who can behave like a douchebag and never suffer any of the consequences. And thus, when you have the song Do Better, which is as well framed by bringing Brandy on as a very harsh counterpoint to Chris Brown and all the arguments he puts forward, and shows the real pain that both inflict on each other in this very toxic relationship. And okay, well, I can't help but feel that the song worked better with Usher over Chris Brown. It manages to play off Chris Brown's aggression in a way that actually makes the track work. It's the highlight of this album. And it's certainly preferable to when Ariana Grande and Jhené Aiko are on their respective tracks, effectively as backing vocalist and nothing else. The former on a song where Chris Brown is in denial about getting left behind, and the latter song where he behaves like a drunken boor who spends half the song sending sloppy texts to his ex, and the other half wishing that his ex was having the worst sex ever. Classy work there, Chris Brown. And you know what? While I'm being somewhat sarcastic there, that's honestly one of my biggest issues with Chris Brown as a singer-songwriter. Nothing comes close to class on the table of this album. Say what you will about R. Kelly, but he at least tries to sound clever with his explicit imagery or sell it with some believable soul, whereas Chris Brown doesn't seem to want to put in that effort. Take Drown in It, where Chris Brown's lyric to imply heat is "It's Fahrenheit here in here." Chris Brown, that's a unit of temperature that can go well below zero. That does not imply heat. You screwed up here. Or take songs like Add Me In, a song attempting to win over girls with bad math-related double entendres like "Your love is trigonometry, just trying to solve the whole equation." Or, "Baby, if we do the math, it will equal up to me." I can only assume that Chris Brown was taking a pre-calculus correspondence course when he wrote those lines because, come on, the bad jokes about these lyrics write themselves. Must have been taking a zoology course too, because on the hookup track Time for Love, Chris Brown says, "I can be your honeycomb and we can fly together." And apparently failing said zoology course because he can't tell the difference between flies and bees. Or take Autumn Leaves, the song where Chris Brown thoroughly blames the girl for the breakup by comparing his attachment to the relationship like holding on to leaves like in the fall. Because when you think about stable relationships, you think of a tenuous connection of a leaf to a tree in a branch in colder weather, which basically implies that when the relationship cools, Chris Brown just falls away and then blames the girl for it. Or to make things worse, says that "I feel safer in your violence." Okay, yikes. Thank God for the Kendrick Lamar verse, which is only peripherally related to the song and more about how he is misrepresented by the media as a thug, the more outlandish his content becomes. Otherwise, I gotta be honest, that song would be completely irredeemable. Unfortunately, irredeemable is a perfect adjective to describe the majority of the songs whenever Chris Brown once talks about bad relationships or his problems with women. Mostly thanks to terrible framing or just plain incoherence. The title track, it starts off really bad with the oh-so-charming line, "If you're only as good as the company you keep, then I'm gonna blame you for everything they say about me." Because it's never your fault, right, Chris? Loyal follows the same narrative through line, with Chris Brown bragging about stealing a broke guy's girlfriend and then saying how he doesn't screw around with broke women and how these hoes ain't loyal. So, what is it here, Chris? You're presenting a real mixed message here and none of it makes you look good. Or take Stereotype, the song where Chris Brown dumps a girl and says he'd really hate to label her as a stereotype. Chris, when the only distinguishing factor for you and your brand of R&B is how much more of a jackass you sound like than your competition, maybe you shouldn't throw stones in your glass house here. The problem on the majority of these songs is framing. If a song like Drunk Texting, for instance, was self-aware in how badly Chris Brown looks in this case, it could work. But Chris Brown is nowhere near that subtle, mostly because he doesn't seem to care how badly he looks or take any responsibility for any of his bad behavior. He just seems to brush it off. Outside of Do Better, the only song that shows any real maturity is probably See You Around, where he acknowledges that he could have been a better boyfriend as he gets dumped, and that he's gonna respect the girl's feelings even though he still has some feelings for her. He's gonna let her move on, and you know what? That does show some maturity. I can respect that. Now, that's also one of the many songs on this album that switches up the production and the instrumentation, which can be charitably described as a mixed bag. The odd and really frustrating thing about Chris Brown's production is that he can honestly put together some decent melodies that have some dramatic presence and swell, but his choice of tones can really fall flat. The opening title track is a prime example. It starts off as a ghostly mainstream R&B tune with a decent crescendo, but the synth tune for the chorus is this oily borderline chiptune derivative that sounds flat and grating with every single wobble. That oily feel on the mix crops up all over this album. The popping on Loyal, the breezy sound of New Flame, the staccato and jerky songs on 12 Play, the reverb swallowed up, drowned in it, the overmixed trap-inspired Came to Do, and the choppy body shots that features both bad pitch shifting, which is also all over this album, and an attempt to jack the breakdown from Martin Garrix's Animals, which, yeah, come on, we notice it here. And the infuriating thing is that there honestly are some pretty good melodies on this album. The Churches-inspired punch of Add Me In, the opening horns on Stereotype, the disco-inspired Time for Love, the indie R&B fuzzy guitars on Autumn Leaves, the bleak heaviness of Do Better, the rollicking groove of Don't Be Gone Too Long, and especially the folk-inspired guitars on See You Around. Sure, the guitars occasionally went out of tune with the rest of the mix and didn't sound all that great, but you know what? It was different. I can appreciate that. But the larger problem was one that's plagued every single Chris Brown record. The production is terrible. I've already talked about the abuse of autotune and vocal effects, but there's a real hollow clunkiness to this album that feels incredibly clumsy in its attempts to add heaviness, especially with the whooshing sound that always seems to precede Chris Brown's entrance into every single one of the songs. Honestly, it just becomes overused. Ugh, look, this album doesn't infuriate me in the same way that Fortune or Graffiti do in terms of Chris Brown albums. And you know what? It does show marginal signs of improvement. But at the same time, this is not a good album by any sane standards of modern R&B. On every single attempt that Chris Brown tries to make to play with the modern R&B and hip-hop greats like Usher or R. Kelly or Kendrick Lamar, or even his contemporaries like Trey Songz, he comes out looking bad. Or, okay, when I say this, when I can say I enjoy a Rick Ross verse more than Chris Brown's presence, there's a real problem with your album here, I'm sorry. Yeah, he's slowly becoming a better songwriter, but he's nowhere near quality R&B, especially in a year with so much good R&B. Okay, yeah, if you're a member of Team Breezy, something that I will never ever understand, and you can buy into his emotional investment, you like his voice, even when set up against very visibly more charismatic artists, you'll probably like this album. But having heard much better R&B from artists featured on this album this year, no, I'm sorry, it's a 4 out of 10, and I feel like I'm being generous here. I will say this though, Chris Brown has gone on saying this will be his last album, and while I sincerely doubt that, while I do think he's lying, well, he could have picked a worse album than this one to go out on, so you know what? Take that for what it's worth. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. Just keep it marginally civil in the comments. I'm not going to read all the hatred. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.